This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
I'm very pleased today to introduce Brad Yonaka. He's an exploration geologist and a numismatic researcher specializing in the coinage of Latin America. He holds a Master's of Science in Geochemistry from the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, and he's written several books, including A Variety Guide to the Silver and Copper Coinage of the Mexico City Mint, 1732 to 1771, A Variety Guide to the Silver and Copper Coinage of the Mexico City Mint, 1772 to 1821, and A Variety Guide to the Pillar Coinage of the Guatemala, Bogota, Lima, Potosi, and Santiago Mints, 1751 to 1772. Today, Brad's going to be discussing the milled pillar coinage of Mexico City. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Brad.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. My presentation today is on the milled pillar coinage of Mexico City, sometimes called columnarios, which was a revolutionary coinage that used a new technology that had not previously been used in the New World anywhere. That began in 1732. And most of my talk will discuss the events leading up to this coinage, and then a little bit about the coinage itself. So if any of you are unfamiliar with this coinage type, this is an example issued the first year of mintage from the Mexico City Mint. It is an 8 reales, a dollar-sized coin that was recognized internationally as a trade unit. And this coin was quite unique in its design. The obverse is not that unique. It has your standard Spanish coat of arms with the lions and castles. In the quadrants, the fleur-de-lis in the middle, signifying all the issues after 1700, and a small pomegranate in the bottom. And to the left of the, then the Spanish, the Royal Spanish crown topping that. To the left is the assayer letter, in this case it's F, and to the right is the denomination. Surrounding this is the legend of the king's name and his titles. This particular coin is under Philip V, so it says Philip V, King of Spain and the Indies. On the reverse side of the coin, that's really the money side. That's the one everyone likes to see. And it has some powerful symbols on it, which say a lot about what Spain thought about their mission and their achievements in the world at this point in history. In the center of the reverse design are the two globes signifying a map of the old world and the new world overlapping, and these are crowned by a Spanish crown. And to the sides of them, bracketing them, are the pillars of Hercules. These are the mythical pillars that line the Straits of Gibraltar, connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Atlantic Ocean. And underlying both of these features are waves of the seas. And this was meant to imply that Spain had brought the two worlds together. And this is reinforced by the legend above it, Utraque Unum, which means the two as one, as in the two worlds have been united under the Spanish crown. And then the date at the bottom, 1732, bracketed by the Mexico City Mint mark, which was a large M with a small O above it. So the two theaters of operation, as it were, for this coinage were on the left, the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which included Spain's colony from where the north border of Mexico down to Panama, that whole area. And on the right, the old country, peninsular Spain. The coinage and the decisions that were made about it On the left, of course, Mexico City, which is where the Mexico City Mint was. And this mint had already been operating since the mid-1500s in the production of the earlier cob coinage. And on the right, of course, Madrid, the seat of the royal house of Spain. And the other city of interest is Seville in the south. This was the main city where all of the treasure ships arrived and offloaded when they came from the New World, bringing, most importantly, the silver that was being mined and then rendered into some form where it could cross the ocean. And later, Seville would lose its importance when the river silted up and that all of that material would be offloaded at the port of Cadiz, slightly to the south. And really, the story of how this coinage came about goes back to an event that happened in the year 1700. Prior to this, Spain had been ruled for a very long period of time under the Habsburg dynasty. And the last king of that dynasty was Charles II. He was quite sickly in his adult years and never did produce an heir. So this constituted a bit of a succession crisis in Spain. And he spent a number of his last years of life trying to determine the best course forward. His main priority being that Spain would not be divided up in any way upon his death. And the best way to do this, he decided, was to not actually nominate or give a successor as anyone from the Habsburgs, but rather from the French House of Bourbon. And he found he found Philip of Anjou, who was a young man, 17 years of age, in France. His grandfather was King Louis XIV, and it was decided that he was the safest successor in order to achieve the goal of keeping Spain from falling into trouble after the death of Charles II. So that's what happened. He died in the year 1700. Philip came down from France and became King of Spain. Now, of course, Philip, as he became known, Philip V, was not Spanish. He did not speak Spanish. He knew nothing about Spain, and he was not interested at all in being king. Nevertheless, that was his job, and he came down and he took the role. And on the bottom here, I just showed two examples of the old style coinage, the old hammered cobs, one issued under Charles II and the other under the first 20 odd years of Philip V's rule. So were there any problems? Yes. The House of Bourbon under Louis XIV had determined that there were significant issues with the political and economic circumstances of Spain at the time. The Habsburgs were a very traditional group. They hadn't moved forward the way that France or England or some other powers had done in Europe. And it was thought that they really needed a great deal of reform to bring themselves up to the modern day. And this was the chance to do it. So Philip V was assigned a number of advisors, many of them from France, and they were going to set about and try to bring Spain forward in time. And one of their big problems was with respect to their colonies in the New World. At the time, there was a saying in the colonies which went, "Se guarda la orden, pero no se cumple," meaning give respect to the royal orders and nod your head, but that doesn't mean you have to do what they say. And Spain, even the Habsburgs, they understood that this was going on, but they weren't doing enough about it. And the House of Bourbon, or rather Philip V, decided that this is what he would address. So the two biggest problems from a financial perspective at this time was, first, the reputation of the coinage coming from the Mexico City Mint. Any of you who are familiar with Spanish colonial numismatic history will know of the mint scandal in Potosi, which occurred almost 100 years before this, where there was intentional debasement of the coinage by mint workers defrauding the crown of its rightful amount of its rightful percentage of the silver mining from that area. And to a lesser degree, this was happening in Mexico City. I wouldn't say it was a scandal of nearly the proportion that the Potosi Mint scandal was, but nonetheless, it needed to be addressed. So, because not only did Spain figure this out through testing of coins that were coming across in the early 1700s, but in the late 1600s, but other merchants all around the world would immediately know and lose confidence in the Spanish colonial money that was circulating there as well. So they needed to address that issue, and also along with this was the issue of the amount received on the annual basis by the Spanish crown through the treasure ships. Any inefficiency, intentional or otherwise, that was occurring either in the Mexico City Mint or any of the colonial mints for that matter, affected the bottom line of how much silver got to Spain. And an important thing about Spain at this time, you have to realize Spain was completely dependent upon the transshipment of silver from the New World to finance both its royalty and its wars that it was conducting all of the time in Europe. They did not have a developed commercial sector that sold anything else, which is something that both France and England had at this time. So in order to assure that that bottom line would not be degraded over time, they had to address the issue of the silver minting and movement of that coinage to Spain. So Philip V took the throne in 1700. He had his French advisors and other advisors on hand. They began to draw up plans for all sorts of reform, both domestic and the colonies. However, the Austrian Habsburgs did not like this move. They were very upset. They had their own claimant to the Spanish throne. And within 2 years, they went to war with Spain in order to remove Philip V from power. This became known as the War of Spanish Succession, and it went on for almost 13 years. And during this time, there was basically very little movement on the reform front. All hands were on deck to deal with this conflict. And this was actually the time that Philip V came into his own as a military. He enjoyed being a military commander, and this was a very exciting time. He was only 17 years old when he took the throne. So he went and he conducted some battles in Italy and so forth. And at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, there were both good and bad things for Spain. The good thing was that Philip V was able to keep the throne, and the claimant from the Habsburgs in Austria was denied his chance to rule the country. The bad part was that Spain actually did lose some territory during the conflict. Notably, I show the picture below of a battle of Gibraltar. They lost that during that war, and a number of other possessions they had in Europe. So they came out weakened but not defeated. even before the war had ended, Philip and his advisors began the process of what became known later as the Bourbon Reforms. And one of the earliest steps in this series of reforms was a plan issued in 1713 called the Nueva Planta, which was like the new plan. And this was both a domestic and a plan for Spain to change the governing councils, the process by which the governing councils made decisions and reported to the king, and also a number of changes in how the colonies were to be conducting their business and how much oversight needed to be made by Spain itself into their activities to ensure that there was no corruption or graft going on. To this end, in 1717, one of probably the most important people that is responsible for the changes that went on at the Mexico City Mint, as well as the other colonial mints, was the assignment in 1717 of one Jose Patiño. And to me, he's kind of the hero of the story. He's very incorruptible, according to sources. And he really only wanted to get his job done in the best manner possible and report directly to and honestly to Philip V. And this was kind of an unusual thing. Normally, people had their own agendas, and you could rely upon them only to do a certain amount of what they were expected, and then the rest they would be playing their own little games. But he really didn't have any other plans other than to serve his king. There was one small issue that occurred in about midway through Philip V's reign. Philip V, as I said, he never did want to be king, but he got into it once the war started. Once the war finished, he lost interest again, and he was looking for any way possible to get out of the responsibility of running Spain. So once his own oldest son turned 17, which is the age he was when he took the throne, he abdicated in favor of his oldest son, Louis I. Unfortunately for both of them, Louis died of smallpox within 9 months. And this forced Philip to come back to the throne from his country palace where he thought he would live out the rest of his life, to go back and push paper for what ended up being another 20 years. The most important specific plan that Spain drafted up during this period was the June 9th decree of mint reform that was issued in 1728. And this mint reform had 3 parts. The first part was the coinage would be intentionally debased slightly to 0.9166 fine silver. The second part was that there would be a new minting procedure altogether. No longer would they be hammering silver cut from a bar as cobs. All of the coinage would be converted into the more modern screw press method, which is what Spain itself was doing and other countries were doing in Europe. And this equipment would actually have a number of different pieces with it. The first would be the screw press. The second would be a large press that would press flat a silver sheet of uniform thickness. Another device that would cut this sheet of silver into round planchets, and then a device called a castang machine, which would place a security device on the edge, on the rim of the coin. And the third component of this decree of mint reform was a change in the design of the coin, and they completely redesigned it. It looked nothing like the earlier cobs. And I've already showed you an example of that at the beginning. Here in the bottom left of this slide is shown a pattern that was generated in 1729. It was made in Madrid, as you can see from the M with the small crown over it, mint mark, that brackets the date. And that, and the fact that there's no assayer letter or denomination on either side of the coat of arms, are the only indications that this isn't an actual coin. And this particular piece is one of the few pieces, it might be the only piece that is known to exist, and it is currently in the Casa de Moneda, the Bank of Mexico collection in Mexico City. And down on the right, I show a old picture of the Mexico City Mint. The building itself had to be reconstructed entirely because all this new mint equipment took up a lot more space than the old process. And this building, though it began construction after this mint reform decree, was not even finished when they began striking the coins. It only finished construction in 1734. So that was actually, that was the easy part of this. The more difficult thing that they had to address was the personnel. And this goes back to that quote I told earlier about not paying attention to royal orders. During the years 1729 and 30, which they should have already been striking the coins, but they weren't ready yet. They had a mint inquiry. A number of officials came from Spain to Mexico to have an in-depth look at what was going on with the people and the process of minting the coins in the Mexico City Mint. And they determined a number of problems. I've showed 4 of them here, which were kind of the main things that were going wrong. The first was poorly controlled weights and fineness. As I mentioned earlier, the reputation of the coinage was starting to go downhill, and that needed to be addressed, whether it was just sloppy work or whether that was intentional and embezzlement had to be determined. The second problem was the misappropriation of management responsibility. There were people being employed in positions that weren't qualified. And this was most notable in in what ended up being a very odd situation where there was a mint mark, or sorry, not a mint mark, but an assayer letter D that I don't know that anyone in Spain really understood who D was. As it turned out, D was not a person. It was a monastery. It was a monastery of barefoot Carmelites in Mexico City. And somehow they had come into possession of the office of chief assayer. And this was a very strange situation because they obviously didn't work at the mint. They knew nothing about what the mint did. And they were supposedly the responsible party for the coinage that was coming out of the mint. I mean, the assayer letter is basically the signature of who is responsible. And anyone who finds a coin of that isn't intrinsically valued correctly can point to that letter as a person, the person responsible for making that coin. And that's the accountability chain of this. So obviously a monastery was not going to be a true responsible party. So that situation was dealt with rather quickly. Another issue was the sale of positions to the higher bidder, which may have been one of the reasons the monastery had that position in the first place. And it seems obvious to us today, when you make a job saleable to the person who has the most money for it, you are almost certainly not going to get someone the most highly qualified to do the job. And this was a real problem for that reason, and the fact that once people who fronted up enough money to obtain a position like a chief assayer assistant assayer or some other key position in the mint, their first priority would immediately become repaying all the loans they took out from other people in order to buy that position. So there's a poor motive there for doing good work. And the last problem that they found was a collusion between the buyers and sellers of silver. There were certain mine owners who were being treated favoritively by the mint at the expense of their competitors. And so rather than have intermediaries work for the purchasing of silver from the mines for the mint for the purposes of striking silver, Spain decided that their own authorities, answerable directly to Philip V, would now be in charge of that. In addition, for the other problem of the sale of positions, the crown also stepped in and directly employed the people who would be doing those jobs. And they also raised their salaries a lot as a motivation to concentrate on quality work. So maybe in March 29th, we don't know that for sure, but that seems the most likely date, was the first time that in 1732 was the first time that the milled pillar, 8 reales, and other denominations were struck at the mint. And I show a picture up here, which is a very common picture to show of what an old screw press looks like. The one in Mexico City Mint didn't necessarily look exactly like this, but it gives you the general idea. It's a large, heavy screw that gets turned around very quickly, and it strikes a planchet that is held there by a mint worker. And you see around on the floor, there are some baskets of milled planchets around him, and these have already been punched out in a circular form. And though you can't see it in the picture, they would have already had their edging devices placed on them by the castang machine. This was done prior to the striking of the coins. And all of these officials, a number of officials from Spain were present for the striking of these coins. So it was a really big event for everybody. Now, as you can imagine, most of the people working in the Mexico City Mint were completely unacquainted with this new process. And so there was a time period where there was a lot of trial and error and learning going on by these people in order to get up to the job. And this was basically the whole period between 1732 and 1734. In 1732, there were 2 types of coins that were produced. There was the milled type, the type that we are talking about at the bottom, struck by the screw press from a milled planchet that had been cut circularly and also endowed with an edging device with a security edge. But these only, in that year of 1732, these only constituted about 2 or 3% of the entire mintage. They just couldn't produce them quickly enough. So the rest of the coinage, in order to achieve the quota that was necessary to send on the treasure ships for 1732, had to be done with the old type of hammered cob, which they could produce very quickly. In 1733, they were actually able to get away, as far as we know, away from the production of the old cob type, and there were many more milled type coins generated that year. In fact, that's the majority of the mintage. However, in order to compensate for still the slow pace of striking coins, there were 2 intermediate types also made. And we call them intermediate but they're not intermediate in terms of that they were a step of learning from going from one type, from the old cob type to the mill type. These are intermediates in that they were just different types of coins they produced just to get them out the door. And the first type, intermediate type 1, was actually a piece of silver cut as the cob types were off of a silver bar with a very irregular surface. But rather than being hammered by hand, it was placed in the screw press, which gave it a much better strike, as you can see in that top photo. And there was also an intermediate type 2 that was generated, and this was actually from the milled silver sheet of uniform thickness. But rather than being punched in as a circular planchet, it was just cut by hand until it achieved the correct weight specs. As we moved into 1734, almost all of the coins struck were of the mill type, as they should be, with a few left over that they had to do with using the intermediate type 2 method. Although by 1734, these coins are actually quite rare compared to the mill type. And that was it. By 1735, all coinage was being done in the correct type that had appeared in the decree of 1728. So you could say it only took them 7 years to do it, 7 years to completely comply with that order from Spain, which is actually pretty good considering that the other colonial mints at that time, won't include Guatemala because they only started in 1732, 1733. The mint at Lima and Potosi took at least another 15 years to comply with this order once they had received the appropriate machinery. So as also the decree of 1728 stipulated the denominations of the coins that would be silver coins and gold coins that would be produced. In terms of silver coins, they just use the same denominations that the cobs had been. That is a half real, 1, 2 real, 4 real, and 8 real denomination. The 8 real being the international thaler or dollar trade unit. So these 5 denominations almost identically appeared for the next 40 years until the year 1771. And it spans the reign of 3 kings, part of Philip V's reign, his son Ferdinand VI, and his other son by a different wife, Charles III, were all kings that were present during the issuance of this coinage, not from the Mexico City Mint, but as it ended up, these same types appeared in the other Spanish colonial mints later on. Very consistent throughout the reign, only the king's name and a few minor design elements changed. And they were consistently the same fineness all throughout, 0.9166. This would change in 1772 with the new portrait styles, which again was an official debasement, slight debasement of the fineness. And down on the right of this, I have a close-up of the security edge of the coins. This is what would have been emplaced by the Castang machine. And this ended up being very important because this had been a real problem during the cob coinage, was the habit of shaving off edges off of the cobs, defrauding the next person down the line who would have them. This security device basically assured that anyone tampering with shaving a bit off the rim would be immediately noticeable. So this inspired confidence in people, a lot of confidence in people to accept this coinage over the old cob type. And just to note the names of the kings, occur in various forms at various levels of abbreviation, depending on the denomination. This 8 real here has, on the top left, has Philip V's name, full name on it. On the top right, we have his son Ferdinand VI, who took over in 1746, and his name had to be abbreviated. Some vowels had to be taken out because the length of the name was too long to fit the coin, even on the 4 and 8 reals. And in the bottom center, I have an example from Charles III, from a 1 real from 1765. And you can see his name has been abbreviated to just CAR3. Now, as I mentioned, there was a lot of confidence inspired by this coinage. It had some unintentional effects. I can only imagine these were unintentional when they came up with the design. But up to this point, Spain had been doing a lot of trade with China through the port of Manila in the Philippines. And the Chinese knew that the COP coinage was usually not intrinsically valued. So they would only accept payment as bulk by weight. And then upon receival of the money, they would immediately melt it down and turn it into some other form. Now, when the pillar coins came out, the Chinese really took note that these coins were in fact correctly intrinsically valued. So from this point on, there was incentive for them to, rather than melt all the coins, to actually accept them at the value that was stated on them. And rather than melt them, rather than go to the expense and time of melting them down, just chop mark them and or just place counter marks on them, which are essentially what chop marks are, and let them circulate as such. And this began a tradition of doing this that extended for another over 100 years down the line, where large silver 8 real units of many different countries began to be accepted in China and counter-stamped for circulation there. And I'll note one kind of interesting story about the start of this coinage was that there is the unusual occurrence in 1733 of some coins in all 5 denominations of milled pillar coins with a different mint mark. And as you can see on the reverse of this coin, rather than the M with the O above it, it's an M with an X next to it. And this was actually all a mistake. Somebody in Spain had been tasked with issuing orders for different design components of the milled coins. And possibly without ever knowing what the coins actually looked like, they had assumed that the mint mark for Mexico was an M with an X next to it. And this order made its way to Mexico City, where the people at the mint knew immediately that that was incorrect. However, it was a royal order. So what do? You have to thread the needle somehow with how to deal with that situation. So they ended up producing some coins with this MX mint mark, and they immediately wrote back and asked if that's what they should be doing. When someone in Spain replied, well, no, that's not the correct mint mark, should be the M with the O above it, that gave them cover to immediately go back to using the correct mint mark. And these are quite, as a result, these coins were not struck for very long during the year 1733 in Mexico. And they immediately were able to go back and do the correct coins. So why collect these coins? A lot of people know about them. They're listed in the Red Book. They're kind of a basis. They're essentially a monetary basis for the coinage that would eventually be issued in the United States. They are quite unique. They are groundbreaking in that they were using a new mint style in the New World that had never been used before. There's a lot of them, a lot of varieties, a lot of years to collect them from, and 5 different mints that issued them. Those including both Mexico City as well as the Guatemala mint, the Nuevo Reino mint in Bogota, Lima, Potosí, and Santiago, Chile. And there's always new things being discovered, even though a lot of people collect these coins. I still see at regular intervals new varieties with different punches that were used for different letters or symbols. There's a lot to be discovered about these coins, and there's a lot we don't know. For example, we don't even know what the mintage figures were for Mexico City. We know it for some other mints, but Mexico City we don't. So there's still discoveries in this series, and they're quite aesthetically pleasing. I think most people really enjoy the balanced and symmetric designs of them. And that's my talk. I thank you, and I'll take questions.
Brad, what was the weight of these coins?
Well, the 8 reals were 27.07 grams was the official weight.
Thanks.
Hi, Brad.
Does anyone else have any?
I do. Hey, Brad.
Hello.
Good to see you. Good to hear from you. Thanks for doing this. Can you speak a little bit as to why the other mints took so long to incorporate this standardization? And I think Potosi, even once they did in the 1760s, were actually making both milled coins and cob coins for close to a decade or so.
Well, speaking specifically to Potosi, because that's an interesting story. The mint workers at the management at Potosi Mint actually were extremely resistant to striking the milled coins. And I think it's because they were able to kind of do their own little system of very slight levels of embezzlement. And they saw this as a threat to what they had been doing. And that is actually why they continued to produce cob coins even during the 4 years that they produced the milled pillar coins. So they could have done it earlier. It's only that they found reasons not to. As speaking to Lima Mint, I think it was more just a situation of the mint simply did not have the resources and the people to bring this about earlier. Mexico City was fortunate in that Spain just sent that machinery right away. I mean, within a few years of the order. Lima was not granted that expediency.
Excellent. Thank you.
Jim McClellan here. Fantastic talk, very interesting. I enjoyed it a great deal. You just answered my question, but I think the comparison with France is very interesting in this regard, because officially French coinage was done with the screw press by, I think it's 1645. And even before that, because of the resistance from mint workers, it's the late 16th century already. The screw press was there, and this décollage between the case in France and the case in Spain, I find very striking.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not something we're used to thinking about so much in the United States, but there was, with Spain in particular in the New World, there was kind of an accepted understanding that you were allowed to cheat a bit. And when the system was changed so that you couldn't cheat a bit, people actually saw that as not being fair.
But in the case of coinage minted in Spain, it was all still hammered through this date?
No, it was they were doing milled coins already in Spain.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right, we have a question from the chat for you, Brad. This is from Larry Schwimmer. He's asking, how were the finuses established? Why 0.9166 versus 0.9305 versus some other number? Do we know how and why they picked a given value? Did they intentionally try not to match other countries' values?
That I don't know. I only know that that over time they were always bringing it down. But they tried to bring it down in a way that would not easily be perceived. Now, I'm not 100% sure that they were secret about the debasement in the 1728 order. From it was maybe a debasement of 1 or 2%. I know that when they changed from the pillar coins to the portrait coins in 1772, that was meant to be secret, specifically because they didn't want hoarding of the older coins at the expense of the new ones. But I don't know exactly why they chose the numbers they did, only that they were looking for ways to do this debasement that weren't so noticeable.
And then does anyone else have any questions either they'd like to ask on video or in the chat?
Yes. I was just looking at the Red Book, and it says for the reales pillar dollars, the prices range from about $120 in VG all the way up to $750 in EF. Is that about right for current market prices for these coins, Brad?
Well, I think those prices are probably geared toward Mexico City issues. If you were to, most of the 8 reals, for example, from the other mints are going to run more expensive than that. I would say EF 750, that seems kind of high for a regular issue, a Mexico City 8 reals. But so yeah, I mean it's more or less in the range for, I would say, the Mexico City. But if you get, say, a Potosi 8 real from 1768 or something, it's gonna be it's a different price tier.
Do shipwreck coins command a premium?
It depends on the shipwreck, because for those coins, it's not at all about the condition of the coin. They usually look terrible. It's about the fame of the wreck.
Thanks.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, I will take that as a no. So just in terms of next week, we will be joined with the ANS's own Nathan Elkins and Lucia Carbone, and they're going to be reviewing and discussing Gladiator 2. So if you haven't seen it yet, and you would like to kind of maybe contribute to some discussion or some way, please see it before next Friday. Be aware there will be spoilers. We will be discussing the movie and everything. So just keep that in mind. But it should be a really fun kind of conversation just about, the movie, historical accuracy and those things. So join us then. And then thank you again, Brad. This was a really great talk. Really enjoyed it. Lots of complimentary comments in the chat.